Welcome to Chapter 3 in Marketing Management. So, today we're going to talk about understanding how different environments can impact marketing initiatives. And this is going to be an important chapter because marketing environments are really radically changing. And a lot of times, marketers are out of touch with who their new environment is and the kinds of changes and the kinds of different ads and promotions they would need to engage with to attract those new markets. So the case study at the beginning of the chapter talked about McDonald's, and McDonald's is an interesting one because McDonald's tends to deal with a number of different types of consumers, but wealthier consumers, lower income consumers, educated, uneducated, a wide variety of people shop at McDonald's. In the past, McDonald's tended to be more focused on kids, and then parents would be almost like byproducts. But then they went through a period where they really focused a lot on teenagers with the I'm loving it teenagers and college students. And now I think they are just kind of engaging with everyone, right? College students, the entire family, etc. The challenge is when you are trying to be a family focused kind of environment, but you still want to attract teenagers, low income, high income. How are you able to segment your market and then create a product designed for a particular market? What you end up being is a jack of all trades, but a master of none. So it can be really challenged. And I think McDonald's has experienced that challenge. Incidentally, when you go abroad, McDonald's is not the same as McDonald's in the US. McDonald's outside of the US tends to be far more upscale than McDonald's inside of the US. And I think part of the reason for that is that in the US, people already have this perception of what McDonald's is supposed to be. But outside of the US, because McDonald's has to use a particular supply chain, they have to maintain a particular standard, particularly when you start talking about low income countries, they end up being upscale fast food, as crazy as that sounds. So positioning changes depending on who you're targeting. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the marketing environment. So the marketing environment has to do with macro and micro components. When we're talking about your micro environment, think of the things that are very close to the consumer and close to the company. So the company, suppliers, marketing intermediaries, and that's basically like your supply chain. But that would also be like your banking sector, your distribution sector, customers, competitors, publics. All those are in your micro environment. And of course, you know the company, you would know the company intimately. And the suppliers, they are going to be, upstream folks that make the components that go into your product. And in a lot of instances, when you are trying to present a particular product to your consumers, then you try to align your supply chain with that product. What do I mean by that? And align the supply chain with who your customers are. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's think of I don't know, Audi car manufacturer, for example. Audi is a high-end car. Audi is not going to pick a tire producer that makes cheap tires. They're not going to pick an upholstery producer that makes cheap interior upholstery. They're not gonna go with a radio and system with speakers that is a cheap low end system because that's going to cause problems with their consumers. So when you're picking a supply chain, you have to think about who your audience is, what your product is, and all these are things that's going to affect you in the long run. Marketing intermediaries. So when we think of the supply chain, and perhaps I might need my little board again. When we're thinking about the supply chain, right? We have to always think about the various different players on the supply chain. And sometimes um, when we think of the players, we don't realize that in order for you to get from one part of the supply chain to the other, you're going to need intermediaries. So, so imagine you have, and I have to come close so that you could see. So on the one end, you have your manufacturers, and then that's going to go to your wholesalers, your retailers, your consumers. Okay? Well, your intermediaries are the companies that facilitate each aspect of the chain. So these are your down arrows. I don't know if you can see very well, but between your manufacturer and your wholesaler, you're going to need some distribution. You're going to need some financing. You're going to need some marketing. Similarly, between your wholesaler and your retailer, you're going to need some distribution. You're going to need some marketing. You're going to need some finance. And so, what does your distribution look like? Your distribution is going to be, that is anything to do with transport. Okay? Your marketing has to do with positioning. And then your finance has to do with funding. Right? So, when we start talking about transport, that's your distribution, positioning, that's your marketing, and then lastly, we have the finance that has to do with funding. Now, what that means is that when you're trying to get product from one part of your supply chain to another part of your supply chain, you have these intermediaries that facilitate that movement. So let's say I am Walmart and I am the retailer on one end of my supply chain. Well, how am I going to get products to sell in my store? How am I going to finance the purchase of those products? And then how am I going to ensure that the people who manufacture those products think I'm an attractive place for them to sell those products? So that's distribution, marketing, and finance intermediaries, okay? And so those are part of your microenvironment. And then, and if you don't think your intermediaries matter, then why is it that you would only get certain products in certain stores? Why is it you're not going to walk into the dollar store and get Ralph Lauren or Gucci? Why is it you're only going to see certain high-end brands in certain retail outlets? Because intermediaries matter. The fact that you are going to use this particular retailer to sell your products means that you think you're somewhat aligned with that retailer. So that means that you're not going to see certain products in the dollar store and you're not going to see certain other products in Dillard's because they don't compute, right? So it's something to think about. Then in the microenvironment, of course, you have your customers. And keep in mind, there are different types of customers, right? You have your consumers, your regular B2C. Then you have your B2B, which is business to business. You have reseller markets. You have government markets. You have international markets. So it's a lot of different markets that we're talking about here. And then competitors. And competitors are so important because when I'm creating my products, I always have to consider who else is selling something very similar. I cannot sell my product in a vacuum. And then last but not least is your publics. And your publics run the gamut, right? That's going to be your financial firms, media, government, citizen action groups, etc., etc. Now, your macro environment, and the thing I want us to think about, we have some control in your microenvironment, not total control, but you have some control in your microenvironment. You have absolutely no control in your macro environment. Your macro environment tend to be those forces that are larger than life. Those COVID, macro environment. California, what's happening in the United States geographically, macro environment. Demographic changes, cultural changes, technological changes, the fact that we have Uber or we have a smartphone, we have no control over those things. So your microenvironment tends to be things that you have some control over, not total, but some, a lot more than your macro, which you have no control. You have no control over whether a hurricane is going to hit your stores, or COVID is going to shut the whole place down. You have no control over macro environment. So your macro environment, demographic forces, is there a shift in the age groups? Is there a shift in the number of women in society, a shift in the number of men in society, shift in more young people or more old people? When you're thinking of demographics, age, income, education, um, and so forth and so on, race, ethnicity, etc. Then your economic forces. That's what, people can afford. Buying power, whether the economy is doing well, whether or not people think people have jobs and they feel confident about spending. Natural forces, any kind of, whether it's a hurricane or an earthquake or something of um, COVID, for example. Technological forces. Technological forces are going to be any new technology that might be disruptive, that might change how we do business, smartphones, the internet. Think of how those things have totally changed what business we do, how we conduct business, what kind of business we do, where we do the business. Having the internet did not create international business, but it certainly does help facilitate international business in a whole new way. And then political forces, right? So the government can assist in business. Governments can make business hard. Right now, for example, a lot of Western companies wouldn't do business in Venezuela. Um, but there was a time where every major multinational had a headquarter in Venezuela. So political forces also matter. And then cultural forces, we're going to talk about that a lot, as we've seen a lot of changes in the cultural environment. And so we're going to talk about when companies have to adapt and change to those kind of cultural changes. So demographics, density, location, age, gender, race, occupation, ethnicity. All of these are big demographics. And in the US right now, we're having a huge change in demographics. So most of y'all are probably in Generation Z. So Generation Z, but let me go back. Let me start up at the top. Traditionalists. So your traditionalists, right now, your traditionalists probably start at about 75 and older. And so these are people who were born pre 1945. Okay? These are your traditionalist folks. Right now, they're about 75 plus. Some of them are still working. Most of them have retired, but some are still working. Then you have the baby boomers, which I know some of you all may say, okay, boomer, right? And your baby boomers are going to be 52, 53, probably up to 55, up to 75, right? They are the ones born 1945, around 1945. Um, then you have your Generation X. That's yours truly. And so Generation X, they are 40 something, early 40s, up to 50 something, like 52, 53. And Generation X is very different from boomers. So your boomers tend to be a lot more traditional, tend to be, want respect, tend to hold on to kind of more formality. My generation was the first generation to have a mother working outside of the home. So we tend to be very independent when we first latchkey kids. Then you have your millennials. And the older millennials are called Yers, and those are in their late 30s right now. But the millennials run from late 20, mid to late 20s up until, 40, 41, 42. And the Yers are like 37 to 41, 42. Okay? Then you have your Zers, and your Zers, y'all are well in, I think they're like from 10 up to early 20s, 21, 22, 23. So those are your different groups, and they call them different generations. And generations behave totally different. they call them generations because they're typically defined by certain things that would have happened. And these things may change, like COVID is going to define a generation, probably Generation Z or the next generation after Generation Z is going to be defined by COVID because it's such a major activity. 9/11 defined a generation. Kennedy's assassination defined. The landing on the moon defined. Columbine defined. So these are major things that happened in a generation and that would define you. And so the idea is that you have to think about, how these major events have changed generations, have made them behave in particular ways, and changed their approach to life, to consumption, all of these things. As marketers, we have to be very aware. So, and now you see advertising on TV that's based on the generations. So you may say, like, what? Well, to be crass, erectile dysfunction is not ad that is geared towards Zers. It's geared primarily towards baby boomers. Similarly, you will see a lot of a home for mom. That's geared towards my generation, Generation X, because now we're putting our parents in, senior homes and so forth and so on. Then you might think a lot of, let's see, I don't know, I'm thinking a lot of Apple ads are geared towards millennials. So sometimes companies might decide to take advertising and get them specifically to a particular demographic. Then you have geographic. And geographic, I want you to think about, it runs the gamut from city to country, nation to international, anything to do with geography, that's your geographic. Natural has to do with anything that's naturally occurring. So whether it's flood or famine, it's hurricane or earthquake, that's your natural environment. And then we talked about technological environment, where what new disruptions have taken place. We talked about political environment. And sometimes when we talk about political environment, that may also be related to like a cause. And what do I mean by that? Well, sometimes depending on a particular environment, you may feel a need to support certain causes in our environment. So like right now, COVID-19 is happening 2020 from, let's say, March, indefinitely going on. And in the beginning of March, you really didn't see any companies putting out any ads about COVID. Now, so many companies are putting out ads and saying, we're there for you, or here's what we're going to do. Fitbit put out an ad saying they're giving free subscriptions for the next 90 days so that people can keep fit at home. Jersey Mike's Subway sandwiches put out an ad saying, on a particular day, they are giving 25% of all sales to Feeding America, food banks, etc., etc. So cause-related marketing is something that's pretty important. The important thing, I think, when it comes to cause-related marketing is to think of a cause that makes sense for who you are as an organization and who your consumers are. So it makes sense that Jersey Mike's would be teaming up with Feeding America because they're a food related business. It makes sense that Yoplait is teaming up with Susan G. Komen because Yoplait focuses, targets women, and Susan G. Komen focuses on breast cancer, and so forth and so on, right? Then culturally is a big thing in the US. And what we know is that typically and traditionally, advertising agencies were not bastions of cultural diversity. In fact, they're some of the most undiverse places on the planet. And that's a real problem because you really want to have people working in marketing who understand your audience and can relate to your audience. Because when you don't have people who understand your audience coming up with ads for them, things can go very, very, very wrong. Like a friend of mine who runs a Latino focused ad agency right here in Stockton. He says to me often he will see people running ads in Espanol, and then when people get to the store, no one in the store speaks Spanish. So why would you run an ad in Spanish if you don't have anyone in the store? So things like that, right? We have to, and I can post a number of videos. I did a TED talk. I'm going to post that about how cultural appropriations is often a problem in marketing. So I think the culture is important, and you have to have proper representation. You have to understand culture, and you have to be authentic in it. You can't just stereotype. Oh, we trying to get black consumers, so we're going to put on hip hop, or we know that a lot of Latinos are into our products, so we play salsa music in our ad. That's not how it works. You have to be authentic and really understand who your audience is and be responsive to the things that they find attractive. So and what would that look like? For example, Latinos are some of the fastest growing demographics, one of the fastest growing demographic groups in the country. And they are perhaps the number one moviegoers in the country. But how many movies do we have that feature the Latinx community in a major way? Not a lot. So there's been a huge gap in understanding and connecting between audiences and products. I remember going to a talk by the head of Latina magazine, and she said, you know, Latin women wear a lot of lipstick. In fact, of the women that apply lipstick more than 20 times a day, Latinas make up 60% of that market. Now, I didn't even know that people apply lipstick more than 20 times a day, but it turns out they do. And she said when she started her magazine and she went to Revlon because she wanted them to take an ad in Latina, they said, do Latinas even buy lipstick? Can they afford lipstick? And she's like, how much are you selling lipstick for? So I think a lot of times as demographics change and companies are kind of forced to go after these new audiences, they often have no clue. They have no clue how to reach them. And that's one of the reasons why, in particular in the Latinx community, a lot of the media has been separate and apart because mainstream has not understood or hired people from those populations who understood those populations. So you have Univision, and they have really developed an entirely different set of programming. And that's problematic because when ABC now is trying to do Latina or Latinx programming, they don't have the expertise. They haven't hired anyone. So a lot of times, but I do think that's changing. I think slowly but surely it's changing. And I think as we have more representation and inclusion, and as companies really focus on it, because there have been a lot of mishaps over the years, right? Whether we're talking about the t-shirt with a young black boy on it and talking about monkey business from an ad campaign with who was it, H&M, or we are talking about Adidas coming up with shackles, sneakers. I mean, the list goes on and on of people making bad decisions around ethnicity because they just have no clue. So I think if there's any takeaway from this chapter is the idea that when you are creating a product, you really have to understand who your audience is and what kinds of marketing messages will be most appealing to that. See you in chapter 4.